Jared is Microsoft Chief Marketing Officer for AI at Work. He's also the chair who's helped us put together the summit. He also has a email newsletter, which you can subscribe to on LinkedIn, which is called AI at Work, where you get his tips for how to use AI in your job. So one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that's really interesting about talking to Jared is that in some ways he's kind of an alpha user. He's at Microsoft where they're trying to figure out how to put AI into the productivity tools. But you also think you've been thinking broadly about how this impacts management, how this impacts jobs, how this impacts the performance of teams. And so I think we're gonna revisit the conversation we've had a few times before about kind of where you see that heading. Before we do, I just want to spend just a second on what what Manuela was heckling you about, which is this idea that AI should say, I don't know, I need help more. And I'm sure that's something that folks at OpenAI and Microsoft think about. And can you share how you react to that?
You know, the jargon in the industry is what we'd call multi-turn conversations. A single turn conversation is I give you a prompt, I expect you to give me something perfect back. And she's exactly right. I mean, the future, meaning in the next few months, you'll see multi-turn where just like a human, you have to have kind of clarity. Like, is this what you want? I don't understand. You didn't give me clear enough parameters. So the AI have, like today, the models, maybe I stop referring to it as AI. These large language models have the capability to do that, but we have not yet enabled, I'd say, the modality the way it needs to.
Okay, so we'll chase Manuela and tell her that that's coming.
I will do that.
She's probably has people in the lobby at JP Morgan scanning their hands with her. So I want to you talk to lots of companies about how they're actually implementing this, and just before we get into how it's working with your own team, can you just give us a quick glimpse of kind of where the C-level executives you're talking to, like what they're grappling with in terms of actually implementing this, getting value out of it? What stage is everybody at?
Yeah, and just for context, I mean, my job is to turn this technology into a big revenue stream. So that just means that I'm very focused on the decision makers right now. So I'm meeting with, anywhere between 1 to 3 kind of COO, CEO, CFO types a day from large companies, names that you would know. I would say that in that set, those folks are done with what I'd call personal productivity. They love that whatever it is, Copilot, ChatGPT is going to save you, 2 hours a day. Awesome, love it. Doesn't mean anything to a CFO's OpEx at all. They can't translate it. So most of those folks right now are very focused on kind of business process reengineering. They're like, hey, give us a process. Let's take a look at it. And if we can't save millions of dollars, in the large companies, tens of millions of dollars, we're moving on to find something else. But the exciting thing is we are seeing companies who are getting to that scale at this point. But it's not in just like rewrite this sentence for me. It's much more fundamental.
Can you share an example? Like what is a business process reengineering that AI enables?
Yeah. Yes, the places where it's driving the most value right now are some of the most boring parts of companies you can imagine, frankly. I'm working with Dow right now. We just showcased them recently, and they have 2 agents and a Copilot is what they put together. They have a logistics department. Think of Dow as producing materials, essentially. So they have a lot of materials that come in the door that are raw materials, and then they do stuff to it, and then they go out as finished goods. Well, the shipping of all of that is a huge cost. It's one of their biggest costs internally of moving those things around. So interestingly enough, you could tackle many parts of that, but it turns out that they get invoiced for things that they're not expecting to get invoiced for, and that shipping happens to all of us. So they've constructed a set of bots that goes through and looks at their logistics invoices, looks at what they're expecting to be billed for, what they actually get billed for, finds the places where there's a biggest difference, organizes those into a stack rank list, and presents those through the Copilot to a team that actually goes to follow up, and they're chasing it down. And they project easily within the first 12 months that they'll save on the order of tens of millions of dollars. It's very difficult for humans to do that type of cognitive work at scale. It's very, very difficult. And it's been actually super difficult for machines to do it because the invoices come in different formats, as you can imagine. They come in PDFs and all these types of things. So it's the most boring thing you'll hear today, but it's an example of what's happening at scale.
Right? That was the most boring thing I've heard today.
Good. But now you're going to remember it. Now
Except
you'll
for
remember
like
it.
the CFOs here, the $10 million savings
Right.
probably gets them quite excited. How do you, just on that, and then I want to shift to how you're using AI within your team. How do you think about, we've talked in part, like we started off the day with James and Dan talking to Marcella about how they're like putting transcripts of meetings into things, and how, one of Manuela's examples was like making it easier to schedule calendar appointments. When you're saying like the thing that really moves the needle for companies is actually not that, it's these other things. Why is the personal productivity activity important? Like, how would you think about that, given what you just said?
I've got so much to say about this, so I'll try to be really terse. Personal productivity, from our perspective, matters for all of us individually. Like, we think it's a big deal. We think that there's a point at which we can deliver enough value collectively that you're going to decide, I don't want to work without an assistant, a co-pilot, or something like that. It gets to the point of when it reprograms your work and you think, man, trying to do this on my own again is really tedious. Like, that matters a lot. But what I'll say that I've heard today that I'll just pull on for a moment is, you heard a lot of like, be curious, curiosity. I'm telling you that there's only a certain percentage of workers that are curious about anything in their jobs. Like, for sure.
Yeah.
And so trying to get your workers to be curious, like, good luck to you. Like, I think that's a big thing. So we believe that if you're going to drive personal productivity, you've got to put it in the flow of work. You've got to put it where people are doing their stuff anyway. As I think about, people that I know and love, like my siblings and my children who are in the workforce, they're just never going to be curious enough to take their meeting transcripts and like take an extra step and put it in. But if you put it in the flow of work, it matters. So we do think that there's a lot to do in personal productivity, but it's going to take some time, and that's the approach.
Yeah.
Then you move over kind of to more business process type of stuff.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think I liked Kelly earlier was talking about, it can't be a swivel chair where you swivel.
Yes, that's
to
exactly
do
right.
something. You need to actually,
Yeah.
you need to actually do it. So let's talk about your use and the use of your team. As I said, you're kind of like a bleeding edge consumer of a lot of these, AI in the workplace. And what are the ways in which it's changed how you think of managing, how you think about your team's performance, that that weren't true 2 years ago? Say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, a couple ideas that I'll give you that, first I'll zoom out away from the technology. What is AI doing? Like, we are in the midst of it. Again, like I said, 10 days ago, no DeepSeek, all of a sudden DeepSeek. Go, Jared's team, figure out what you're going to do. I would say that we talk about the speed of the age of AI. I think no matter what you do, I happen to be on the bleeding edge of that, so I feel it. But you will all feel it in your businesses as AI speeds up the clock speed, if you will, of your industry or your function. So number one, I think as a leader, you need to be thinking, what happens if we were to double the speed at which I'm supposed to operate? So that's one thing in my team that we've really been focused on. Another thing that we've been really focused on is then, okay, how do you deal essentially with the energy of your people in that type of scenario? And again, I know that doesn't sound like much of AI, but if the speed is doubling, you can shove all sorts of tools in front of them. But if they're like, I can't do another thing, you have to really be thinking about how you do that. And that leads to my last thing, which is organization in the age of AI, at least in our team. We are finding it is flatter. It is more fluid. It is more generalist than ever before. In my team, I've literally been up on a stage in front of my team and presented and said, look, here, folks, for the last 20 years, we've essentially played this game like it was American football. You kind of drew up a play. Everybody knew their routes. You were going to go run them. You got in the huddle. You threw it. Then they did a TV timeout. Everybody grabbed Gatorade. You talked about what you did for a while, and then you went back to it. That type of formation, I don't think will persist in business. We're now talking about rugby. Like, there are no TV timeouts. The play keeps going. You get smashed. That's too bad for you, but you got to get the ball to somebody else. That fluidity and that way of working is very different. And it'll allow me to talk about the details of the technology in a second, but those human things are very important, because I underestimated probably 18 months ago the impact on my people, that was going to be very different.
We just did a conversation recently with General Stan McChrystal, and the thing that he said, which a lot of people said, is they liken it to combat. That's his own experience. And he says, your battle plan, no battle plan survives the initial contact with your enemy. Which is kind of, I think, what you're
Totally feels that way.
What you're saying. So can you talk a little bit more about, and actually just to click on one thing you were saying about the energy and the speed, and I guess one of the risks, which we've talked about before, is burnout. Basically, you can't run people at like such, constant speed. Uncertainty is actually a big factor in terms of people. Do you have any specific approaches to that aspect of team performance?
Well, some of my teams here, we're trying some things. We have tried some new, very simple approaches to it. One of them we call tag in, tag out, which is much more, again, rugby-like than it is American football. And it's this idea that instead of being always on, the way that you are demanded to be always on, you establish a formal routine for tagging out and saying, hey, I'm out right now, and I'm going to be out for the next number of hours or days, but I'll be back in. And you make that a formal part of your culture so that people can manage their energy. For us right now, we're making a major announcement related to this technology once every 4 weeks or so. That may not seem like much to you. We used to do that once every 3 years. So the pace
Windows
is exactly,
Microsoft Windows 4.0.
you got it. It's so big. So creating kind of a formalized structure for how you tag in and tag out. Hey, I'm out for the next. So for me, I talked about being a preacher. Hey, at 6 o'clock, I'm like Fred Flintstone, yabba dabba do. Like down I slide off the dinosaur and off I go to preach. So I tell people, hey, I've tagged out, from 6 to 10. If it's really urgent, you can get me back at 10, but you won't see me. Like I'll be doing other things. That discipline can be incredibly invigorating for people because they don't feel like they're always on. They feel like they're given the permission to not always be on.
And people use Teams and Slack indicators, rightly.
Never Slack, but always Teams. But you can quote me on that. But you could theoretically use Slack if you wanted to.
You could. So I want to hear a bit more about how AI is changing. So you mentioned a few things. Like one is the organization is flatter, and that's actually something that researchers have found when you bring automation in, org structure actually flattens, and there are fewer managers. It sounds like you're thinking about that.
Absolutely.
As well.
Yeah. We have many areas today where we have senior individual contributors, very senior individual contributors that have no team or staff underneath them. And we've actually, I won't bore you with all our levels and things like that, but where you used to essentially scale with FTEs, hey, this is a really important part of the business. We're going to staff up a team to go after it. We instead will tell people, we want you to do it differently. We want you to use a combination of AI. And in some cases, we do use vendors. So they're not FTEs, but AI and vendors that are a little bit more project-based. So one example of that again, this is the boring part of today. I talked about invoices and logistics. I'll talk about another part. We have a part of the team that's all about essentially doing demos so that you can visualize how this technology works. I typically would have had a team of sometimes as big as 15 or 20 people who do that. Today, I have one senior individual contributor, very senior individual contributor, and he uses a combination of the AI and Copilot and agents plus a vendor team to do that work. He is always trained. Anything you see Satya Nadella do or I do or anything, he is behind that, and he does all of the script writing. He does much of the imaging, all that type of stuff, with essentially a staff of vendors and AI together. But that structure is totally fascinating. We would have thought it was so important to staff up, like I say, 10 to 20 people. One person does that for us today. That's very different.
Another thing you mentioned was just the idea that people need to be generalists. And I think that's one of the debates that at Charter we've engaged with a lot is what is the value of expertise as AI comes in, because you can effectively summon knowledge using AI agents. How do you think about the value of expertise and being generalist, which you mentioned before?
Yeah, I've said that before. I feel like I'm learning, so I'll update you on what I see. I think of it this way. When I was educated as a computer scientist as an undergrad, the first class you took essentially was how to code in machine language. Nobody codes in machine language any longer, but your job was to figure out how that worked so that you knew how a compiler worked, because you write in code, the code will turn it into machine language, and then the underlying thing will run it. The OS will run it. I think that there's something to be learned from computer science education in that learning the skills, like learning how to do things at a granular level, makes you a better assessor and manager of those skills. It's really tough to say, well, you've never been an editor before, but here, take this writing from this AI tool and edit it or assess it or pass your judgment on it. So in many ways, I think we do need generalists, but we need generalists that have been educated and have some experience in the skills over which they will preside. So that, I think, has an implication for education. You know, imagine if today what you kicked out of a 4-year program wasn't kind of like an entry-level student, but someone who actually had spent 2 to 4 years essentially overseeing AI as it did the tasks that will need to be done. You hopefully would be able to graduate mid-level managers into the workforce, but that's not the way we do it today. That's a future I could see.
So we talked a bunch with Manuela about agents, and she sort of laid out kind of how they work. And I think one of the things that I'm hearing is people are starting to imagine that you have agents in your org chart. So you have a team and you have some workers, and then you actually have some agents, and where you might have someone, to use Manuela's example, who is scheduling meetings with a person. Now you have an agent who does that. You might have someone who's project managing. Well, maybe for a certain project, you actually have an agent who's effectively project managing it. Do you agree with that vision? And if yes, like how proximate are we to that playing out?
Yeah, I would, but I want to add to it just for a moment. Again, my job is to try and think about how we make these things very mainstream. So I reason by analogy often, and I'd use this analogy. In the mobile era, we saw an incredible burst of innovation and a change in the way we did things based on the iPhone and apps. I could go to my mom in Kansas and be like, Mom, here's your new iPhone, and the way that you add stuff to it is an app. Like, here's where you go, here's what an app can do. That idea of the modularity of an app, you can add it in, but the personality or the personalized nature of the iPhone was really good. In today's world, in this era of AI, we would say that you're going to have a copilot and agents that will mimic what the iPhone and apps did, or choose your favorite smartphone. But I think the iPhone's pretty good. So we believe that people are only going to get comfortable with agents when they start to understand how they could use them. And I'll be honest with you, trying to have an individual navigate even 5 agents at a time is going to get overwhelming for them. It's very difficult. It would be like me telling you you didn't have a smartphone, but somehow you had to keep in your head or your hand 5 apps somewhere. You wouldn't even know where to go to get them. So we do think there's an organizing layer that will be required. We call that the copilot. You know, Google calls it Gemini. It will be other things. Yeah. But now in terms of, is that headed here? Well, yes, agents will allow you to essentially augment what your assistant, your copilot can do, and they will do all sorts of things. They certainly will go book things for you. They absolutely will look up prices of things. They will dive into processes in a corporate context. They will allow you to do things that today you call on a person to do. No doubt about it. But that modularity of that's what an agent can do for you is very good. I'll say one last thing. You better trust that agent. If you don't trust that agent, you won't use it very often. That's how we feel about apps as well. So there's some of the issues here aren't just getting it in the right flow of work. It's also helping people have experience so they trust these things, so they don't feel like it's making mistakes on their behalf.
I'm going to ask you the question that, just because it's so recent, is the DeepSeek that I asked Manuela. In terms of those of us who are not in AI technical companies, what are some of the implications? And obviously, I think Microsoft congratulated High Flyer on releasing DeepSeek. Do you see implications of that for how we wind up using AI?
Yeah, I'll try to be as simple as I can, but quick in a way that's useful. The first generation of models that we have seen up to this point, let's call it up to about GPT-4, which is what ChatGPT is based on today. That first generation of models was based on an algorithm that's the same algorithm, essentially, that you have in your autocorrect on your phone. It essentially is, what's the probability of the next word given a set of words? That's the underlying algorithm. That algorithm could do what we call kind of basic reasoning. It allowed you to solve really basic logic problems, essentially, but it could reason, and it was quite good. Well, before we get to DeepSeek for a moment, OpenAI introduced a new set of models. They call their O series of models, first with O1 and then O3. This introduced reasoning as a core capability into the models, and it allowed it to do what we call advanced reasoning, reasoning that kind of orders an expert in their field of expertise, so mathematical reasoning, scientific reasoning. That was huge. It was introduced last December, as if that were like 20 million years ago. That's when that happened. Well, DeepSeek essentially has replicated what we've seen with those O class of models, but on a totally different kind of magnitude when it comes to the amount of money required to do it. So their claim in the press right now is that they were able to do it for $6 million. These other models we're talking about were done on the order of about $100 million of training. So that's the difference, and that's why everybody kind of freaked out. We also have something, not just training the models, but running the models, and we have been able to see that DeepSeek is much cheaper to run than what we see from other models, including those GPT models. So right now, it not only has replicated the state of the art to a degree that is pretty exciting, it's done so at an entirely different economic cost, both for training and for what's happening in what we call inference or test time compute. We would say at Microsoft, wow, fantastic. You know, it's just an example of how, A, we believe these models will continue to be commoditized. It's remarkable what's happened. And B, we just think, man, isn't that exciting? Because if those economics hold, we will see applications of this technology across all sorts of places. And we think that's better for humanity. We think that's better for everybody here in the room.
So it'll accelerate things. I have one last question, and then we're gonna step off the stage. It's about meetings, and you know, I think everybody in this room probably and watching virtually spends like much more time that they actually would prefer in meetings. And one of the areas that I think you've used AI and Microsoft's ambitions for AI in the workplace, one of the big focuses is like, how do we have better meetings? How do we make sure you don't have to attend a meeting that you don't need to attend? How, if you don't attend, that you could actually still get the relevant value. So we've talked about this in the past. Can you bring us up to speed on like what you're excited about in terms of meetings and kind of where we're at?
I'm mostly excited about not attending them, if I'm honest with you. And I do it a lot. These days, if you have your tool, whether it's Zoom or Teams or anyone else, you know, most of them have AI built into them. At Microsoft, we record most of our meetings. We have a retention policy associated with, so at 30 days, those recordings get trashed. But having a recorded meeting means that I honestly attend fewer meetings. The meetings I used to attend where I thought, oh, there'd be 10 minutes or 5 minutes in there that I probably need to represent or hear what was said, I can just go back to, you know, using Copilot, go back and ask, hey, on this particular topic, what was the discussion and what was the decision? I think that's incredibly important. Our telemetry shows that about 60% of the average knowledge worker's time is spent in what we call coordination overhead. That's email, that's chat, and that's meetings. That's a lot. That means you're only getting 40 cents on the dollar for every FTE you employ these days. No wonder if you're a CFO, you're grumpy, because you kind of feel like that's not, you know, that's not a really good return on people even.
Yeah. So Jared doesn't like to go to meetings. Manuela doesn't like to talk to people. We've got a really like extroverted group here up on stage.